It has been almost 2 weeks since the armed conflict between the Sudan Armed Forces and the Rapid Support Forces began. As a result, hundreds of people have been killed, thousands have been injured, and the conversation about Sudan's democratic transition has evolved to focus on preventing another civil war. Today, we are joined by Hamid Khalafallah, a development practitioner, researcher, and policy analyst based in Khartoum, Sudan. Hamid works as a program officer for the International Institute for Democracy and Electoral Assistance in Sudan and is a non resident fellow with the Tahrir Institute for Middle East Policy in the United States. Hello, Hamid. Welcome to Security in Context. How are you today?
Thank you so much for having me. I am safe and at home in Khartoum, where fighting is happening all around, and currently experiencing a power outage. It's 40 degrees Celsius, so it's quite hot, but otherwise doing well.
It's pretty hot in Spain as well. Climate change is terrible these days. Anyway, not to go on to talk about a different problem, right? But to start, could you give us a brief update on the most important developments that have taken place in Sudan over the past week?
Absolutely. So, since the conflict erupted almost 2 weeks ago, there have been multiple initiatives to mediate and to try to at least establish a ceasefire, and then, start discussions about let's go to talks and try to resolve this conflict politically, and so on. However, every single ceasefire that was announced was not honored by both parties. The latest one was announced the day before yesterday, and it was a US sponsored ceasefire. Anthony Blinken, the US Secretary of State, announced it and mentioned that he's been brokering between the two generals, the leader of the Sudanese Armed Forces and the leader of the Rapid Support Forces paramilitary, and they both committed to it. However, just in the few hours after the announcement, they broke it, and it continued to get violated until a few minutes ago. I could still hear gunfire nearby my residence. So I think, this is the biggest update, is that the war is continuing, but not only that it's continuing, is that it's both leaders do not seem to be ready yet to commit to a ceasefire or to end the war soon in any way.
I'm so sorry that this is happening. The uprising of the Sudanese people and the mass protests that took place in 2018 and 2019 inspired the region and inspired the world, particularly because the popular movement insisted on nonviolence. They succeeded in gaining a number of important victories, including the push for civilian rule or at least a share in government. So, could you explain to our viewers the impact of that popular movement and what has happened since then that led to these events that we see today?
So obviously, the popular movement that started in December 2018 and continued throughout the past 4 years, nonstop, even when we were in relatively peaceful and democratic era, if you like, when there was a civilian transitional government between September 2019 and October 2021, the popular movement still continued to be very active, mobilizing people and advocating for their demands and so on. And after the coup, also orchestrated by the two generals that are currently fighting each other, took place in October 2021. The popular movement was always there on the front lines, on the streets, demanding for the return to the civilian democratic transition and so on. So it has always been very active, and obviously their work and their very big role changed the rules of the game in Sudan, and it changed the way things are working, and that upset a lot of the old powers that were trying to find their way back to power, like the former regime of Amir al-Bashir that was overthrown by the revolution, and also a lot of people within the army who have ambitions or think that army should be in control and the army should be in power. The rapid support forces paramilitary, who is the leader, who is essentially building his way to presidency. He has always had that aspiration, and so on. So the role of the resistance committees or the popular resistance movement in general has threatened the interests and the privileges of these people directly. And this is now why we see them, carrying out a full-on war, fighting against each other over power, but by extension, they're trying to say to the resistant democratic movement that you will not have a future in Sudan. One of us military leaders will win, and we will be, in charge of everything.
What are the Sudanese civil society groups calling for? Like, what are the main demands that are being raised internally and also to the international community?
So basically, there are a few things that people are focusing on now. The first thing is to end this war immediately. That is the first demand, and there's a popular campaign around, with slogans along the lines of "No to War" and so on, which are all focusing on ending the war immediately because we cannot afford an extra minute in this war. It claims the lives of it. And in average, and people's lives should never be reduced to numbers, but statistics helps us in kind of seeing the impact. So on a daily basis, we lose in average about 50 people to this war. Now it's been today is day 12, and we know that at least 460 people were killed, and that is a very tiny representation of the actual magnitude of things. I'm sure there are so many people who are killed but not accounted for, because when you drive around Khartoum, particularly in the main streets where fighting is happening, you would see bodies of people thrown on the side. No one is able to take them to bury them or to take them to a morgue. It's a horrific situation. So people are calling to end this war immediately, and then for the flow of humanitarian assistance to reach people who are currently suffering a multifaceted crisis because of the war, because of the economic situation, because of the power outages, water outages, lack of shortage in cash flow, with banks being closed and telecom networks falling apart, and no access to mobile money or mobile banking apps and so on. So people are literally locked in their houses with no electricity, no water, no food supplies, and no money and obviously very few very little chance to leave the house to seek help or so on because of the security situation outside. So getting humanitarian assistance to flow to these people suffering is also a priority. Then the third thing is to get back to the political process that would take Sudan out of this bottleneck and so on. And that would obviously an important part of that political process when the time is right, because now there is no way to discuss a political process in the middle of war. But when the time is right, a huge part would be putting an end to obviously military or militaries multiple intervention in politics and in governance in Sudan.
It's horrifying. But aside from everything you've been describing and the death toll, what is the economic and humanitarian impact of the recent events?
Yes, it has been. It's what we're living currently is, a full-on humanitarian crisis in all aspects and so on. Obviously, like I said, there have been, in terms of services, there has been a huge problem in terms of providing water and electricity to people. Most neighborhoods have been suffering of outages of these services since the war erupted back in April 15th. So it has been quite difficult for people, but also there's huge crisis in terms of food supplies. Food supplies are running out. Sudan largely depends on importing food supplies. That is not obviously happening. Agriculture and vegetable and fruits and so on are not reaching people because of the war. And stores around are mostly closed anyway. So people are really running out of food supplies and would, eventually, if this is not solved, some people might have to starve to death. And then there's the medical care situation. Over 50% of the hospitals in Khartoum, the capital city, where the healthcare is quite centralized. Development in Sudan in general is very centralized. Khartoum had most of the development, and the rest got bits and tiny pieces. So most of the healthcare is centralized in Khartoum, and over 50% of that is out of service now, either because hospitals were bombed or because the hospitals are in very risky areas where neither medical personnel nor patients could reach, or because they don't have power at the moment or water to run the hospital, so operationally it's impossible. So functioning with around 40%, and even that 40% is still experiencing severe shortages in terms of staff, in terms of medical supplies, and citizens also find it very difficult to reach these hospitals. So there's a huge healthcare crisis also happening at the same time, because most of the health care providers or hospitals or so on are located in very critical areas that are close to either the military headquarters or to the presidential palace or so on, where most of the fighting is focused. So it's impossible to reach there. And then you have also people trapped in their houses in these critical areas who are unable to leave, and no one is able to rescue them from inside their houses. So they're left to live with whatever they have already had in their houses 12 days ago.
Wow. Well, I wanted to ask you also, zooming out a little bit, because there's a lot of discussion about the role of regional and international actors such as Egypt, United Arab Emirates, Saudi Arabia, and other countries. So, could you explain the role of international powers? And do you think it's a simplification to call this a proxy war, as some, media outlets have referred to it?
I think it's certainly a simplification and a reduction to the size of the problem, but also it's one of these, you know, Western-centric approaches that the different media outlets tend to use, or different Western governments tend to use, where all problems happening in the global South are happening because something is happening in the global North, or so on. So all of a sudden, the whole problem of Sudan is now reduced to being, a proxy war for Russia or so on, because everyone is currently upset at Russia and so on. It is one of the factors. The actors fighting do have connections with Russia. Russia has been supporting them in so many ways. But this is not why they are essentially fighting. There are so many reasons that are local and that are Sudanese, that are based on the Sudanese context, and them fighting over power over Sudan. But that being said, and how there are so many localized and complex reasons for this war, there is this regional dimension. So the Rapid Support Forces have been helping the UAE out during the war in Yemen, and they have built very strong connections with them. They have benefited of that war financially, fighting for the UAE in Yemen and so on. and that is one of their biggest regional allies. Then they have also connections with Russia, and they have also connections with Israel, who have been supporting them as all these actors have been supporting them as a paramilitary by selling them weapons or providing them with money or so on. Then on the other hand, we have the Sudanese armed forces that have very close connections with the Egyptian army and the Egyptian regime, and have been receiving unlimited support from them also. And that is also one of the complications of the thing. And then they also have connections with the Israeli government, and or a different fraction within the government. So both actors that are currently fighting have these regional extensions, but I don't think I think it's wrong to oversimplify the whole problem to these regional kind of linkages and so on. But in the same time, it's important for the international community to capitalize on these regional linkages and use that leverage to exert pressure on both fighting armies, fighting militaries, to end this fight right now by using pressure exerted through these regional and transnational linkages.
In a recent tweet, you state that pushing for safe passages to evacuate internationals without simultaneously pushing to end the war will be terrible. Is there a generalized perception among the Sudanese people that they are being left behind by regional and international actors?
Well, yes, obviously, regional and international actors, arguably played a huge role in the current context that we are currently living. Ever since the revolution happened and so on, we could it's I think easy to say that international actors have been pushing for this partnership with the military and suggesting that it's better for the civilians to work with the military, because Sudan is fragile and the security situation and blah blah blah. So that kind of partnership between civilians and military, which we could say to some extent, led us to the current context that we are living in and so on, was in so many ways brokered by the international community. So I think it's just a bit disgraceful, let me say, to just pack and leave and not look behind when you were part of the people who created the current problem and so on. I appreciate the importance and the urgency of evacuating, diplomatic staff and take them to safety, because if they remain, they will obviously become target and they will become part of the game that is now being played as part of this war. So it's important to evacuate them. That is not, I do not deny that. But I think the same leverage that the international community had to secure safe passages to evacuate the international or foreign diplomats and so on, they could have used that leverage at the same time to at least secure safe passages, for instance, for humanitarian assistance, because they have successfully been able to secure safe passages for people to flee the country, to get evacuated. Planes have been coming down and landing and taking off like there's no tomorrow, all day around the clock, and it's still happening now. Yet no one can provide humanitarian assistance, and that makes you wonder, what were the priorities of the international community when they negotiated the safe passages for evacuating diplomatic staff.
I want to end with because the what you were mentioning before about the global south constantly being ignored, or the conflicts in the global south being framed in terms of the global north usually. I want to end with a question about how this conflict is being covered globally, because I recently saw on Instagram actually a post by Khalid Beydoun, which said, 200 Sudanese civilians were killed this past week as violence between rival factions intensified. This has received minimal coverage. If Sudan were in Europe, this would be global news. But the context is Africa, and the victims are one black, two Muslim, three tied to a region stereotyped as violent and uncivilized, unlike Ukraine. Not to frame this in terms of or compare it to the conflict in Ukraine that's happening, that's been happening for over a year. But what is your perception of how this is being covered globally?
I think it's we have been seeing this over and over again, and these hashtags that you would see, or captions that you would often see on social media. Not surprised, but still disappointed. So I think that kind of frames how I feel. I'm not surprised, but still disappointed. I think we have been seeing this happening over and over again, where the global North, or Western governments, or even Western nations, also sadly in many cases, would even when they know about the conflict going on in Sudan or in anywhere in the global South, there's an assumption that it's it's less big of a problem. It's not a huge problem because these people are used to it. They're used to wars. They're used to having tough times. They're used to suffering and so on. So it's not a huge problem. But if this happens in the global North, people here are not used to it, so it is a big problem, and we need to support these people and so on. I get that it's sad, but it happens. It's often easier to sympathize with those closer to you in terms of proximity and so on. But I think it kind of does not take into account all the transnational dimensions of conflicts that we're living. Like I said, the current conflict that we're living is very deeply rooted in the Sudanese context and so on, but it has regional dimensions. International actors have played roles in it, but also if this war continues, it will spread all over the region. Spreading all over the region would have impact on Europe or on other continents and so on. So every conflict that happens anywhere is very much transnational, and I think people should view it in that way. But I also hope a day would come where a human being's life is equal everywhere, regardless of their race or nationality or where they live or so on. But yeah, I think that is still the case where the conflict in Sudan is not getting enough coverage that it should get, given the magnitude that I can see right now, and I don't think it will get it. But yeah, it's sad, but we have been seeing this over and over again.
Yeah, and I think it's kind of a vicious circle where the more something gets covered, the more people empathize with it, and the more people, the more you know about something, the more you have feelings about it. So it is very important that news globally cover this conflict just as much as they cover any conflict that they consider to be closer in terms of geographical proximity. Before we wrap up, is there anything you'd like to add that we haven't covered yet? Or
Yeah, I think one important aspect that I would think we should all focus on, like I said, the priority now is to end the war. And if there are any policymakers who are hearing this, or if there are any people close to policymakers or planning to do anything about Sudan, yes, the priority is to end the war and everything. But I think part of why we're here now is that you know so many people in Sudan, but also this is, in my opinion, an imported kind of notion that Western governments have tried to impose on us, and in so many ways, I think that it had been a new colonial kind of approach where Sudanese people, and by extension people in Africa or in the global south are always asked to kind of tone down their aspirations for democracy and to focus on security and stability in your countries or continents and so on. And you should not be too ambitious in terms of asking for democracy and so on. And I really worry that after this war, that narrative would become even stronger, that in Sudan, let's not talk about the democratic transition. Let's just end the war and focus about peace building and so on. And that would obviously allow another authoritarian regime to come and govern Sudan for God knows how long and so on. So I think it's important that as we focus on ending the war agenda, is that we shouldn't compromise the democracy security nexus and kind of only focus on security at the expense of democracy. We need to kind of push for, yes, we want security, we want peace in Sudan, but we also want democracy altogether. And I think, after a 4 years revolution and people being out in the streets every day asking for democracy, I think they have earned that right to ask for democracy to be treated as important as security and peace.
Hamid Khalafallah, thank you so much for joining us today at Security in Context. I really hope that things get better soon, and that that not only the war ends, but the conversation about democracy continues until it is a goal that gets achieved. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much for having me.